Hi, Misha here, and in the summer, kind of went over the original AK milled receiver again, and covered quite a few variants in the AKM in a different video. Recently, did a video on the AK74 because Fox had never fired one, and put out a video on the original RPK simply because I had not fired my Legion USA in a long while. Well, with all that, might as well revisit the RPK74 in 5.45 by 39. So here are my two examples. This is an old Vector kit build. The kits were marketed as Bulgarian, but really the parts originated in Russia on a US receiver, NODAC. And then of course the FIME Group Vepr FM RPK74, which yes is an RPK74M. However, whereas there's quite a few differences to note between the AK74 and the AK74M, truthfully, that's not the case here. The RPK remained remarkably unchanged, so we'll include both. We will also look at various magazine types and styles. Why not? There's not much information out there, and I can't say as I've really learned a whole lot over the years since my last video, but it's wintertime. You've got nothing else to do, right? So let's hang out and talk about Russia's small caliber, high velocity, light machine gun. The original RPK, the Kalashnikov handheld machine gun, aka light machine gun, well, it replaced the RPD, a belt fed, although both still fired 7.62 by 39. The idea in 1959 was to have a similar light machine gun and standard infantry rifle. Use the same mags, the same bullets, the same components as much as possible. But there was a development process. Even though they wanted to adopt kind of a family, there were competitors for that. And also, while the RPK was nominally adopted in 1959, it did not actually go into production until 1961, so a couple of years after the AKM. The RPK74's story is a little different. While the AK74 also went through testing and trials, as we talked about in a recent video with several near contenders, the RPK74 just seems to have been a given. Once the Kalashnikov-based AK-74 was selected, initially going into pre-production in 1973, being officially adopted in 74, and kind of going into full rate production by 77, 78, it was only a matter of time Molot would follow suit, adapting the RPK for the new small diameter, high velocity round. But it would be a couple of years lagging. I cannot find an exact year of when the RPK74 went into production. However, it was in service by the time of the Afghanistan War. So probably between 1976 and 1978 in that kind of time period. Maybe 79 on the outside. And it was very similar to the RPK74. I will say though, before we get into it, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to really help support the channel, check out the link to our Patreon page. And just to kind of reward you for that, here's some shooting footage. FM RPK74. Sorry, we're using some old footage there, but it still works. With the uncertain future of 5.45 ammo, I am cautious with what I have. Even if it's enough, it goes quicker than you think. So, obviously the main difference, RPK fires 7.62 by 39, RPK74 fires 5.45 by 39, or if you really want to get into it, 5.45 by 39.5. Starting at the butt, the same. Originally, it had a wood stock, paddle-shaped, same. Just like with the others, around 1984-85, they started going to what we think of as this plum furniture. Standard pistol grip. It's worth pointing out that Molot grips always had the kind of concave checkering, not convex. And they can range from shiny, plum, to matte. And of course the early ones would have been that kind of brownish bakelite. We still have a 1.5mm stamped heavy-duty receiver. All of your 74s have the dimple-less magwell with reinforcing plates inside. They have the 50% heavier top cover with the kind of lip, kind of an overstop for the safety there. One thing, with the AKM and AK74, we went to a lighter, simpler to use recoil spring and guide system. With the RPK74, they continued to use the machined two-piece style guide rod and the heavier duty braided spring, along with a slightly longer receiver, and this was to give it a reasonable rate of fire of around 600 to 650 RPM. And that's because, much like the original, it still has a fixed barrel. It's pressed and pinned in, not quick changing, so you don't want it to overheat. Again, like the original, it's about 23¼ inches long, has a bipod under the barrel, cleaning rod, and it was threaded 14x1 left hand. Here we come to a difference. The original RPK in Russia typically just had a muzzle nut. The 74 standard had this really cool, in my opinion, birdcage flash hider. I don't know, I like it. That's because night vision was coming more into use at this time, although it wasn't exactly standard, and just based on experiences. It did give it a slightly longer overall length of nearly 42 inches. On the other hand, this is actually slightly lighter than the RPK because of the thinner barrel, smaller caliber, even though it's the same length, of roughly 10 pounds, whereas the RPK was about 10.5, again, unloaded. Like Molot's stuff, it was mostly all machined. Machined carrier bolt, of course, bulge front trunnion, originally wood handguards, soon switching to the polymer in the 80s, windage, elevation, adjustable rear sight. Russia said these are really quite good out to 500 meters, decent out to 800. Max practical range they listed at 1,000, and full range up to 3,000, but at that point it's just kind of volley fire lucky shots. And finally, the magazine. While they worked with various drums, including the famous Pancake, in the end, because of experiences with the original RPK, they just went with an extended version of the AK-74 mag, originally in this AG4 material, what we call Bakelite. The original mag, of course, 30 rounds. These extended to 45. Being able to swap out mags did help with the rate of fire. It did require this somewhat long bipod, and it still had a tendency to monopod. Take a look. I need to hold this here. Yeah, you see it's on the bipod, but it's there. Of course, when you're holding it in real life, you'll grip it and pull it up, and aiming down the sights, it's fine. But if you need to leave it on the ground because it is a machine gun, you have an issue. Now, one partial solution, they modified the coupler so that you can do this. Okay, tilt it over. They just expanded the edges from the original pattern, and of course your cleaning rod is effectively your bipod stop. So that was one way you could leave it at rest. Easier to do than with the original. Note the pinned-on hardware, very standard AKM. This ring in the middle to help support this long cleaning rod, otherwise, yeah, it could get flexed very easily. And note the second ring here. No bayonet lug. Standard long stroke Kalashnikov system. Standard front. Very standard. This one has the more traditional sling with the shoulder strap. And this one does have the rail on it. I probably wouldn't have preferred it, but that's just how it was built. Those would have been known in service as the RPK74 N essentially standing for night vision. While this is a standard Warsaw packed rail, therefore optics would fit, they really didn't think about daytime magnified optics. They were thinking of the NSP3 and others, and it was a special thing. Molot did not produce these in near the numbers that Mishaco did the AKM, because these were intended to be used one per squad. This was to be used in the assault role as a standard rifle, essentially, fold up the bipod, or in the defensive role, the fixed role, deploy the bipod and deploy it as a medium class machine gun alongside the PKM, which obviously delivers heavier fire. So they were in service in Afghanistan, and actually would not be until around 1980 that Western intelligence agencies, namely America, would confirm the existence of the RPK74, and that just further lends credence to the notion that this came out later than the AK-74. Nevertheless, it was in service in that war, and it, along with the cartridge, became quite infamous, and including its plum look. And it proved to be as reliable, even maybe more so, than the initial RPK, because, frankly, 545 tends to be a little more reliable than 7.62x39. But the trade-off, 7.62x39 is a lower velocity and did not heat up as fast. One downside to these, they did heat up a great deal. So the pinned-in barrel was a bit more consequential here. So gunners really had to monitor their rate of fire, lest they start smelling cooking bacon. Yeah, note the rear sight, smooth top cover, sling swivel on the side. Of course, the buttstock has a storage compartment, and standard heavy-duty rear trunnion. These continue to use machined rear trunnions, not the cast. Machined trigger guard, non-dimpled. And again, this Bakelite mag, at least initially, along with the wood. But around the same time the came into use, we got mags to match. Let's talk about that for a minute. In the beginning, the original RPK 7.62x39 was carried with one 75-round drum and one pouch containing 4 40-round mags, so about 235 rounds on the person. Then they switched over to dropping the drum, for the most part, and just issuing 2 pouches, meaning that we are carrying 320 rounds. It's getting pretty heavy, though. Of course, one of the benefits of going to a smaller cartridge and a lighter synthetic magazine, even if it does hold a little more, we save weight. So, yeah, for the same weight or less, when we have 2 pouches here, we're able to carry more ammo, 360 rounds. So yeah, 2 pouches were standard for the RPK. And like I said originally, we had these Bakelite mags, and just like with the 74, they could be topped off by 15-round stripper clips, and in fact, clips and guides were issued to the gunners. Although, interestingly, at least these pouches don't actually have spots for them. But these are kind of the either-or because they have 2 snaps. But these are Russian pouches. Now, next, to go with the plum, we had a plum mag. Except, as you know, I don't have plum mags. They look just like these, but in that plum brown hue, whereas these are the so-called true blacks. But they had this horizontal pattern. These are often called waffle mags. They're really not. This pattern gives strength, sure, but it also gives a really nice gripping surface, whereas these are pretty slick. And these mags were a little lighter and a lot more durable, still with steel reinforcements. So yeah, they upgraded them in the 90s to true black from the plum. Sorry I don't have any. Just one of those things. Can't have it all, guys. But that's how these guys were kitted out. Of course, they had cleaning gear because it's a machine gun. They had an extended sling, usually with a shoulder pad. Sometimes with 2 hooks instead of 1, because why not? And sometimes also with a folding stock. There was the RPKS74, even an RPKS74N, at least in theory, with a rail. This originally had a wood side folding stock, later polymer, and it's very similar to what we'll look at on this gun up here in a bit, although there is one important change. So, how did the 74 do in Afghanistan, and was it a success on the global market like the RPK before it? Let's put the modern mag in our gun here. It does match better. Anywho, yeah, these were deployed in Afghanistan, and basically Russia was ahead of the curve on armored infantry mobile. They would dismount from a BMP, breaking into a main team and a fire support team, and an RPK or a PKM, or sometimes both, or sometimes just 2 RPKs, depending on the strength of the squad and what they needed, would dismount as part of the main group, typically held in the hands of privates, sometimes corporals. And they did well. They're lightweight, relatively compact size. Like I said, this is about 42 inches and about 10 pounds unloaded. The side folding version reduced that down to 33 inches, which was greatly appreciated in the BMDs, the airdroppable little armored vehicle. In fact, because weight was such a priority in the BMD, it used a mounted RPK74 as its secondary weapon. And the RPK74 could be fired through the ports on a BMP without any modification to the vehicle or the gun. It was kind of set up for that. Again, these were meant to be used as machine guns, but also rifles, kind of either or. And in a lot of ways, that was very successful for Russia. Now, these were only made by Molot in Russia. While it was a much smaller factory compared with Izhevsk, Tula, it built enough. In fact, the mags all came from Molot as well. At least they were Molot marked. But the RPK74 was an export, a commercial failure. Lots of reasons for this, and I don't want to go too into the weeds in this video. But when it comes to the comm block, like I said, these kits came out of Bulgaria. Bulgaria adopted the gun in 1985, and at first just got them from Russia, later assembled them at Arsenal Circle 10. However, it doesn't seem like they made all their parts. In fact, it seems like a lot of them were either virgin parts from Molot or scrubbed Russian parts remarked with Bulgarian. Even though these kits did have Bulgarian markings, I am doubtful they made components like these receivers, even trunnions. Although I'm sure they made furniture and all that. This is Russian furniture, by the way. Only Russia ever made true plum. But put a pin in that, because we are going to revisit the Bulgarian topic a bit later in this here video. Yeah. For the rest of the comm block, they really didn't get into these, because by the time the RPK74 was becoming available, Russia always kept the first for themselves, especially being at war. The comm block was breaking apart. East Germany would leave. Czechoslovakia and a lot of the others never even adopt 545. And it just didn't go anywhere. As far as like South America, Africa, those places which had purchased the RPK were really happy with the 7.62x39 round and did not want to go with 5.45. I think the few that wanted to go to small, high velocity ended up going with 5.56 NATO because, again, the writing was on the wall for the end of the comm block by 1986, 87, and certainly by 89 and 90. So very few takers. In fact, one of the few countries that actually purchased these in the Asiatic sphere was Malaysia, and those were in small numbers. So by and large, the Soviet Union was the major predominant user of the RPK74 and its variants. In fact, there's really only one other comm block nation in East Europe that kind of went with it. Of course, I'm speaking about Romania. And of course, this is not one of their 5.45 variants, but you know it's one of my favorite guns, so I'm happy to bring it out. And actually, the way I've got this set up is really good to talk about theirs. But first, in case you're nodding off, wake up. AES-10B, full throttle. Helps if I charge it.
You're good.
Gotta interject a little shooting footage for fun. Yeah, this one is, of course, in 7.62x39. Romania was already kind of unique in manufacturing a licensed variant of the RPKs, the PM64 LMG, which they did up through really the end of communism. But they adopted 5.45x39 along with the PA-86 rifle in, well, 1986, although production took a while to get going. And that really seems to be the case for their RPK74 derivative. But they did not get a license to produce it from Russia. Rather, they took this gun and kind of just expanded it. Yeah, even the PA-86 wasn't a licensed gun. It was a Romanian creation. We don't even for sure know the name, although I think PM93 is now accepted. For a while it was said maybe it was a PM86 or PM89 or PM91. But the heavy-barreled light machine gun version in 5.45 from Romania seems to be the PM93 last time I checked. And there were two versions. There was a fixed stock that has a pretty standard club foot, although it did have a hinged butt plate, kind of like an M14. Neat. But a lot of them you see have this crutch folding stock. Of course, it's plugged into a standard rear trunnion, standard 1.5mm receiver no matter what. And a lot of them have the classic Romy dong. Now, one good reason this is a good example to kind of look like a PM93 is it has the Romanian pattern birdcage flash hider, which a lot of those did. Different from the Russian. Of course, it has the Romanian adjustable bipod and this carry handle. A lot of Americans think of this as a Romanian RPK carry handle, and as they should, because these have appeared on a lot of AES-10Bs. But have you ever noticed when you get a PM64 parts kit, again the 7.62x39 version, it doesn't have a carry handle? It's not because they were thrown away, it's because it never had it. This carry handle came in late and was made for the PM93 or whatever we'd like to call it. I'm not saying they never put it on some late PM64s, I simply do not know, but it was really made for and used with the 5.45 version. Otherwise pretty similar, including the mags. The Romanian PM64 was issued with steel 40-round mags and never went to polymer. And when they did the PA-86, they made these steel 30-round mags in 5.45 for it. Very unique, very similar to the Polish, but a little different. They could also be topped off by chargers, stripper clips. Now, I can't put this in the gun because they intentionally designed these in a way where they won't fit in the wrong caliber gun for soldiers. But for their RPK, they made this mag, but in 40 rounds. Not 45, 40. Pretty unique. I'm hoping one day we'll see either an AES-2 or at least parts kits. But then trying to find a RPK545 barrel and a receiver could be a trick, because finding it for the Bulgarian kits was already hard. Nodak was one of the handful of American companies to ever make the proper receiver. But just wanted to share that because they do stand out in being essentially the only country to build and issue the RPK74 style gun outside of the USSR, former Soviet Union. And it is still in service today, although they've been wanting to replace it. Alright, as much as I love my gun here, I guess I better put her back up and get back on track. What do you think? With really the rest of the world kind of ignoring or just saying nah on the RPK74, I guess we should too. And let's let the Soviet Union fall and move into the 1990s and talk about the RPK74M. GRAW designation 6P39, sometimes, especially early on, referred to by the Molot company as the RPK 200. To kind of match up with the Kalashnikov concern at that time, Izhmash AK100 series, the AK74M, the AK101, the AK103, and that whole family. And with those, Izhmash actually made a lot of changes, some to kind of standardize things like rails and folding stocks, others to make production cheaper, others to make the gun easier to service, just lots of changes. But when it comes to our RPKs, Molot didn't have to change a whole lot, or didn't want to. And they waited a couple of years after. Izhevsk started really before even the end of the Soviet Union, around 1989, and the project was completed by 1991, although some last-minute changes to the AK-74 were still being made as late as 98, 99. Molot would pick up around 93, 94, introducing the RPK-74 here, it's the RPK-74M, and that's why we've got with this Vepr. So, we have a slight update to the bipod coupler, and we have a slight update to the flash hider. Externally, it probably looks the same, but it actually has a little bit of a thinner wall. Also, the way the front sight base is made, it's a little different. And the barrel hardware, you notice, is the dimple press style. Whereas this is the traditional pinned on, here and here. This is kind of following what Izhmash was doing. Well, I should say that, except for the front sight. That was still pinned on for a very simple reason, which I'm sure you know. The only effective way to get your bipod off if it's damaged, especially the coupler, is to pull your front sight. An armorer can pull pins and press them off. When they're dimple pressed on like this, though, that requires a machine. The part you drill out is wrecked, and you run the risk, especially if you've been drinking, of getting into your barrel. So it would have been a very bad idea to dimple press the front sight base. So they did not. While Molot continued to use mostly machined parts, they did go to a few stamped components, like for example the handguard, upper retaining lever, and they went to the newer style, kind of dimpled in, riveted in style of trigger guard. Like I said, they went to the all black magazine and all black handguards to match. Now typically they would have had an all black pistol grip, but I like this Molot Ergo grip, and some newer guns do have it, so it's on my gun. And just as Izhmash made the folding stock standard, Molot did too, borrowing from the RPKS74. Really with only one change. This lever here was added to fold our stock. Let me demonstrate. Pull it back with one finger, and with the other, you'll need to fold it over. That's why I stopped the camera for a minute there, and then it latches to the side on its own. And to unlatch it, just as on the original RPKS and RPKS74, even when they're still woodstock, there's a recessed protected lever in here. You just grab it and unfold. So they made that pretty easy to unfold for the airborne that would be using this. But how did they fold it, and why did they want to make it complicated? They used a hole, of course. Deploying it was what they were concerned about, getting out of a vehicle or dropping paratrooper, although typically paratroopers would drop inside BMDs and others. But they didn't want it to fold up on someone during heavy use in the field. So you would take a bullet tip and press in here, this hole, and that would activate the same lever. So essentially the mechanism is the same. They just turned the catch on the left side into a catch/latch. A small thing, but you can understand why they did it. They also standardized the Warsaw rail, as you saw. On this side, everything looks normal. Still a machined carrier. One change, this has a non-fluted piston head, like the AK-74M. Otherwise, the internals are pretty well the same. Because of the added stuff and the heavier rear trunnion, this is heavier itself, even though it has polymer furniture, at about 11 pounds. And the 45 round mag remained standard, although they did experiment with other stuff. The most famous, and the one that was probably produced the most, being this 60 round quad stack casket mag. Now, of course, mine is from Puff Gun. Original Molots are exceedingly expensive in America. But these are a good facsimile, even being made out of the same fiberglass resin type material, polymad, and the newer ones even have steel reinforcements. They could even be topped off by stripper clips. Note how this is the D ring back here, sling. I like to keep it on the folders. So it still has the collar that allows it to cant over to the side to keep it from monopoding. But what's nice is it barely monopods when straight up and down. This is not much longer than a 30 round mag, but with twice the capacity, and is considerably shorter than a 45 round mag, while still being very simple to disassemble in the field and clean, and they're actually quite reliable. I think they look really good in these modern guns, and it's just a unique thing, because they kind of always wanted more capacity, but they weren't willing to go back to the drums. They did experiment with various drums, 93, 95 rounds. Nothing really seemed to stick for a while. Even these were not really fully officially adopted, but yeah, you do see them crop up in the field in Russia from time to time. What's your favorite 545 mag from Russia? There are some pretty neat ones. I like pancakes. FM RPK74. I'm sure you know, but yes, this still has a storage compartment for a cleaning kit in the stock. Still has the paint over phosphate finish, 1.5 mil receiver. Again, very unchanged, all things considered, with most of the changes being kind of out here on the barrel. So, Izhmash, today Kalashnikov concerned, made a whole family in different calibers for the AK-100 series. Molot did the same thing here. This is the RPK74M. They also made the RPK201, which was the exact same gun, well, maybe without the, with a bump rivet. This one doesn't have a bump rivet. It has a bump rivet. Don't ask me why. That's just how they were. Moving on. In 5.56 NATO 223. The RPK203, to correspond with the AK-103, was in 7.62x39. It was often colloquially known as the RPKM because it was a modernized version of the RPKS. How did these do? Not well. There were no major orders as of about 2018, and with the world situation, doubtful there will be now. The only real user of the RPK201, again the 5.56 version, is Fiji. And while a few 203s have been sold to private institutions in Russia, or maybe small military special units, maybe a few former Comblac states needing to replace RPKs, or even a few African nations, no major adoption. They were just kind of bought as, attrition replacements. Yeah, by this point, the world has kind of moved on. Even though these are really good, battle-tested guns, it is an 11-pound gun with a fixed barrel and a box magazine. So, yeah, not a commercial success for Molot, although, of course, the 74M was sold to Russia. We do have one other gun, though. We should do some comparison. Yep, let's go ahead and do that now. Ever wonder why this mag exists? A 45-round 5.45 mag made in Bulgaria by Arsenal, a country that quickly transitioned away from 5.45 in the 90s. Well, I guess you can use it in 74s, and of course it has commercial potential in America. But no, there was a legitimate reason to create this. Arsenal's very own LMG. And this is their take on the Kalashnikov-inspired light machine gun. They started making these in 1971 in 7.62 by 39, and in the 90s and 2000s, like Molot, they had a product line featuring these in 3 calibers. Of course, 7.62 by 39, 5.56 NATO, which their military is moving on to, and 5.45 by 39. I'm not sure why. Export market, I guess, probably. For some reason, IWI made some guns and that. And they suffered the same fate. They had no major sales of the 5.45 variant. And this isn't actually one either. This is in 5.56, but it's close enough that the mag actually fits and the guns look identical, at least to each other, but not to an RPK, because, as I've said in previous videos, even though they call this the SA-RPK, it ain't. I know you know, Bulgaria never adopted the AKM with its stamped receiver. They continued using and modernizing the original AK Type III. And since the RPK is based on the AKM, in a large scale, at least the technology used, when Bulgaria began making what they called the, well, sometimes it's referred to as the AR RPK, later today the LMG or LMGF, they based it again on the original AK. And in fact, even though it's meant to fill the same support role, the devil's in the details, and this is not very similar. For one, obviously we have a milled receiver. This is a press and pin barrel. Original ones in the 70s could have been screw in. I'm not sure, sorry. But modern ones would be press and pin. Because of the milled receiver, we have a 2-tang rear trunnion, thus a totally different buttstock. Pistol grip is standard, standard top cover. The barrel is interesting because even though it is roughly 23 inches, the same, it's a pretty much straight profile with very little taper. It doesn't have the center ring, and it does mount a hinged bipod, very much like a PKM bipod, which is shorter. And note there's no cleaning rod under the barrel, thus loops and everything. Your cleaning rod's in your bipod. Now, this is threaded 14 by 1. Pay no attention to the muzzle brake. I put it on a muzzle that is standard, and handguards. So, yeah, while this is Bulgarian and correct, it's very much like an RPK. And while the semi-autos were known as the SA RPK here, it's not parts interchangeable, namely the barrel, which is kind of a bummer because these barrels were everywhere for a while, and you can't use them for kit builds like this. Speaking of, I brought this back out because now we're getting into theory time. What I've been talking about is more or less fact, assuming I got my facts right, but my next part is just totally me kind of conjecturing. When we did the SLR 105 and 104 video, I pointed out that some SLR 105s had Russian parts. On top of that, several AKS74 and even some AK74 kits we saw had some Russian parts, from Russian furniture to Russian trunnions. So one reason I first think these are Russian parts, at least a lot of them, is because of this gun here. This is what they started making in the 70s, and they continued making through really the early 20th century and even today. To make this, they would have had to have tooled up making a special front trunnion, somewhat special rear trunnion, a special 1.5mm stamped receiver, a different profile barrel, and other unique parts. Keep in mind, the AK-74 Bulgaria was going to issue to every infantryman. Well, you only have one LMG per squad in the Soviet doctrine pattern that Bulgaria adopted. They didn't need that many. Wouldn't it be easier just to get parts from Molot and then make some at home, like your furniture? And I can tell you for sure, Bulgaria never made Bakelite mags. The ones might have been scrubbed out of Bulgaria, but they were Russian. And if they didn't make their mags, who's to say they wouldn't make I don't know. I just find it interesting that this has so little to do with the RPK74 compared with this. I just have a suspicion that because they adopted these so close to the end of communism, Arsenal never fully switched over to making all the parts in-house, especially with the end of the Afghan war. Russia was giving them leftover parts around 1990. They just didn't need to. I don't know. Either way, that's my conspiracy theory for the day. SA, RPK. Real quick before we wrap things up, this is, like I said, the 5.56 version, which is the most common, the SA RPK5. The SA RPK7 is the 7.62x39 version. The rare one is the SA RPK3. That's the 5.45. Looking on Bulgaria's websites, they don't even list 5.45 as a caliber option for the LMG. They tried it, it didn't work out. Oh well. 5.56 and 7.62 are the options. The only ones we have here, now all these SA RPKs are assembled in Las Vegas using a nominally US made receiver with Bulgarian barrels and all that. The 7, pretty, they made them in limited numbers, but they're out there. The 5, they made it in more numbers. The 3, they only did a couple of production runs. Not many exist. And I don't really regret not picking one up, because that configuration with a milled receiver and 5.45, while cool and an amazingly smooth shooter, wasn't used by military, because the LMG pattern we see here with the modern furniture and scope rail really didn't come in to the Arsenal catalog until the early 2000s. I remember seeing the semi-autos on their website around 2002, 2003, so they were out by then, but that was a pretty new thing. So by that point, Bulgaria was already ditching 5.45. They made some, they shopped them about, no one bought, they moved on. FB Radom in Poland did the same thing with the Buril. They offered a Buril 5.45 in theory, but no one bought it, so they never mass produced it. Anyway, we can talk about this more later. I just wanted to point that out because I knew someone would mention this gun, and this is one of the cooler magazine variants. And this is an actual 5.45 mag, typical Arsenal quality. It's a lot of shots. And of course it fits a standard 74. Well, let's go back to Russia and let's wrap this here video up. I'm getting hungry. The RPK74M was kind of introduced to be a companion to the AK-74M. When the AK-12 and the subsequent AK-15 export model were released by Kalashnikov Concern, Well, Molot would end up partnering with them, using some of the same tech, and kind of a joint release would be the RPK-16. It had a interchangeable barrel, either 21 inches or 14 inches, and it was designed to use a sound suppressor, and it had a detachable bipod on the handguard. And many think of this as the replacement for this gun. Well, that may or may not be true, because more recently the RPL 20 or RPL 2020 has gone into testing, and that might be the actual next replacement, because Russia has this habit of flaunting technology, saying they're adopting it, buying a few, and then moving on. It's kind of what they do. So we don't know. What I can tell you for sure, not only is the RPK74M very much the standard today for being the squad automatic weapon, it's even mounted in newer vehicles like the BMD3 and the BMP4. The RPK74 and RPK74, the originals, are still officially in service, as we've seen recently in Ukraine. So neither one is considered obsolete, and yet Russia says they're replacing them. In 2018, Russia announced the RPK-16 would be replacing the RPK-74M with deliveries, at least in large quantity, by 2020. But it seems like with feedback from the field, with soldiers actually using them en masse, that's where the RPL might be coming in. But again, it's such early days. Who knows? One thing is for sure, 545 isn't going anywhere in Russia, and both the cartridge and these guns are being used on both sides in Ukraine right now. And those really are the only users of the RPK-74 series. Russia and former states like Kazakhstan still has some, Georgia still has some. Other states in Eastern Europe either never adopted them or have already traded them off, like Bulgaria. It's not a failure because it was bad, it's a failure because of global politics. So, yeah, cool guns. There isn't a ton of history, which is kind of amazing. The video is as long as it is, but I'll try to be thorough. Yes, I know I make long videos. I'm good with that. Hey, you're the one that stayed here this long. I'm much appreciative of it, but if you're here this long, obviously you were either that bored or there was an audience, right? So, kind of justifies me making these, does it not? Really nice guns. When it comes to 7.62x39, the closest we have to an original RPK is an import, is the AS-10B. And we do have an RPKM version in the Vepr series, the RPK47 Type III. We don't really have an original RPK74 import at all, period. That's because, again, they were really only made in Russia. Nothing has come out of Romania, even though those wouldn't be originals. So we had to build from kits, and even the kits are pretty few and far between. It's unfortunate, but at least they did have the original barrels. Of course, the Vepr story we've told in several videos, but this is as good as it gets for an RPK74M. The Vepr 1V was a good semi-auto of the RPK201, and the, like I said, FM RPK47 is a good analog for the RPK203. Neat guns, but very specialized in their military roles, and they appeal to a very specific, insane type of person like myself when it comes to collecting and shooting. But worth doing a video on. So what do you think? Which caliber would you prefer an RPK in? Or maybe you like the Bulgarian take? Let me know. Let's have some discussion in the comments. Why not? As I said before, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help the channel, maybe get a little early access or some behind-the-scenes stuff, check out the link to the Patreon page. Because we actually have some pretty, hopefully, neat stuff planned for the end of the year. I guess we'll find out, right? With that, this is Misha, and also on behalf of Fox and J-Ro and the rest, we will catch you very soon next time.